Welcome and God bless. This is a special that we're doing on the Wesleyan Revival, the Methodist Revival, or the Evangelical Revival that happened during the 1700s. We did a Bible class in Spanish, and so we're doing this in English for those of you who understand the language better in English. And what we want to do is speak a little bit about the revival that happened that was led by the Wesley brothers, specifically John and Charles Wesley. And today I have a special guest with me, and it's my brother, David Martinez. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, brother.
David is a brother, a preacher, an evangelist, and a lover of the Wesley brothers and the movement that the Lord used them in to bring revival during the 1700s.
I'm a direct product of it, too.
All right, direct product. There you go. So who better to have with us today than our brother David? And so what today we're going to do is pretty much just give an overview of the life of Wesley and then talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Methodist movement and revival from his time forward, so that we can be able to learn and grow and see how we can be able to adapt the good things and learn from those things that were weaknesses in that movement. So I would like for us just to start by talking about John and Charles Wesley and the place that they were born. So according to church history, we learned that John and Charles Wesley were born to their parents, Samuel and Susanna Wesley, correct? Right. They were born in Epworth, England. Wesley specifically was born in 1703. And at the time that Wesley was born, England was really a dark place. There was many things that were going on. For instance, there was a gin problem. Gin is a type of alcohol that they used to distill in those times. People would get so drunk that they would even sometimes have to stop parliament events and estate matters just to be able to deal with the drunkards that were there. There were parents that would mutilate their children in order to deform them and get more money as they begged, just so that they can be able to feed their addictions more. There was a lot of different immoralities, a lot of corruption in the state. In the other side of Europe, we had France, who actually was going to have a revolution, but England was on that path, and if it were not for John and Charles Wesley and the Methodist movement, they would have ended up with a bloody revolution, just like the French.
At least that's the way some historians put it, as to the positive effects that the Great Awakening had on Europe at the time, on England at the time.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I would probably categorize it by saying that there was corruption, widespread corruption, at least in three different spheres.
Okay.
So you have ecclesiastical corruption, which we would argue, of course, as ministers, that would be the worst kind,
yes,
and the one that we're primarily interested in. So
yes,
that you see that the Church of England had fallen in a sort of a deadness,
okay,
a coldness in terms of the things of God. And I have read, even from like Dr. Vic Reasoner and a couple of other historians, how at the time the sermons were powerless, and sometimes they were categorized as three different kinds of boring. So talk about being ineffective, you know.
All
People
right,
would have cake, they'd have wine, they'd smoke during the services.
Wow.
The rich were able to reserve certain benches, and so the poor were very much unwelcomed in the church at the time. And of course, there's always exceptions to all of these things. You know, I would hate for some Anglican brother to feel like this is a mischaracterization of the Church of England at the time. But it is pretty well documented that the Church of England had fallen into ecclesiastical corruption and just spiritual deadness. So that there was, I have even read about newspapers at the time talking about how there were ministers of those days, Anglican ministers, that would even solicit sexual immorality. I had read of one
Wow.
of the ministers at the time saying something to the effect of, "Oh, it's raining outside today, and that's why a lot of women aren't at church, but they're home, they're at home in bed, and I wish I was in bed with them."
Wow.
You know, so you have those kinds of comments being made from the pulpit. So you have ecclesiastical / church corruption. You had social corruption, which is kind of what you were describing there,
Yes,
with the different kinds of addictions and the obsession with cockfighting and all sorts of violent sports. And then you had political corruption as
Okay.
well. So you had dirty politics, which people feel are synonyms now, right? But you had political corruption where it had come to the point that even the nation was executing prisoners, it was hanging them, and this had become sort of a sport as well, where people would gather and spectate to see these hangings. So you can't, it's hard to overstate really how bad the situation was in England. But I would encourage those that are watching this video and those that listen to us speak to really take the time to explore a little bit as to how the situation was. It was really dire.
It was dark.
I mean, the problem was bigger than what we can perhaps describe in a couple of sentences.
Okay.
So I think the more you see how difficult and how dark those times were, politically, socially, the poverty as well. Ecclesiastically, exactly. The more people see that, I think the more they'll be able to appreciate exactly what God had done through the Great Awakening.
Amazing. Well said. Well said. And this is the context into which John and Charles, but we're going to focus more on John. And as Robert Lee Arden actually mentions, he was the head of the revival while Charles was the heart of the revival. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And so into this context, John was born. His parents were Susanna and Samuel. Samuel was actually a pastor within the Anglican Church. And both of them come from a Puritan background. And this is one of the reasons why the way that Susanna raised her children was with very strict discipline, but also with much affection. She was very well loved by her kids and also by the church that Samuel was pastoring. And as she brought them up, there was this one night where the Wesley family was sleeping, and because of Samuel's, if we could say, character, personality, his type of preaching, his way of confronting sin in the congregation, there were many who didn't really like him. And so one night, the house mysteriously caught on fire. And after that happened, the Wesley family got all together. The parents took the kids out, only to notice that there was one child missing. That child was John Wesley. John Wesley didn't notice that there was a fire going on. He actually probably thought that it was daytime, but he was wondering why nobody came and woke him up. And so when he comes to see these flames, he goes to a window in the home, and that is where some of the neighbors were able to see John Wesley. Samuel, his father, tried to go in on multiple attempts, but the fire and the flames were just very strong. And as he tried to go in, he was stopped and hindered. And so the men did a human ladder, and they got on top of one another in order to reach up to John. And the moment that John saw that the ladder this ladder of men was there, he jumped out, and at that very same moment, the roof of his house collapsed and almost killed him, but he barely escaped. And at that moment, his parents actually cited a verse that comes from the book of Zechariah, if I'm correct, saying, is this not a branch that I've plucked from the fire? And from that moment on, the parents, Samuel and Susanna Wesley, knew that there was a special calling upon the life of John Wesley. Anything you would like to add on that?
Yeah, no, I would just, of course, all that is true, but what comes to mind is, you kind of alluded to the fact that he had a strong character, Samuel Wesley. Don't forget that he was also a priest in the Anglican Church. So John Wesley was exposed to church life, to the life of a minister at a very early age. And of course, John was 5 years old when that fire happened. And there's a theory that I've read in a couple of books that it was actually the parishioners that started that fire. We can't prove that. We don't know. Yeah. But Samuel Wesley was not really necessarily popular with his parishioners. And so there's actually an old movie that I really like. It's I forget what it's entitled, if it's entitled John Wesley or if it has some sort of title, but it's about John Wesley. You could find it on Amazon. It's pretty cheap. And it's a movie reenacting his life. So there's an actor who plays as John Wesley. Not the new one. I'm not a big fan of the new one. Okay. But it's an old one from like 1950-something, I think. And so it looks really old. The sound is old. The quality is old. But the reason I mention it is it's my favorite one because they actually quote extensively from Wesley himself in the movie. But at the opening scene, they sort of hint a little bit as to there might have been a connection between how unpopular Samuel Wesley was with the
Yes.
parishioners and the fire itself.
Exactly,
So,
yes.
at the very beginning, you see somebody kind of like warning Samuel Wesley, Mr. Samuel Wesley, you better watch out. Something may happen. And then the next scene, there's a fire. So it's not explicit in the movie, but it's sort of hinted at this idea from long ago. So I think John Wesley, since he was little, had already been exposed to the price of ministry,
Yes.
the sacrifice of it. And those of us that minister in the things of God today, we know that there's a price.
course,
You
of
see it
course.
by reading the scriptures. You see it by the Apostle Paul's life, by Christ himself. Paul telling Timothy that anybody who desires to even live a godly life was going to suffer persecution.
Yes.
And the Apostle Paul's life was a very difficult one. His ministry was full of suffering. So Wesley was exposed to that. And then you also get Wesley at a very young age also exposed to piety, the godliness
yes.
of his godly mother.
Yes.
Eric Metaxas is a famous author. He's really fun to watch. You should listen to some of his talks and lectures. He's really sarcastic and really funny. But Eric Metaxas, he's most known for this book he wrote on Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yes.
I think it's called Pastor, Prophet, and Spy, something like that. You've seen it, right? They're
Yes.
really super thick book, like a million pages, really thick. And it's got the face of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the front. But anyway, he wrote a book entitled Seven Extraordinary Women or something
Yes.
like that. Or do you
Yes.
remember what the exact title is? Seven Great Women, something like that.
Yes. I think he also has one about men. Also.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, the one for women, one of those seven important women is Susanna Wesley.
Wow.
And I mentioned that because Eric Metaxas is not a Methodist. He's not a Wesleyan. I think he's a Presbyterian or a Baptist or something like that, or a
Okay.
member of Timothy Keller's church. I don't know. But the point is that he's not a Methodist. And yet even a non-Methodist like himself, would point at Susanna Wesley and say, something was awesome about this woman,
yes.
the godly way. And in many ways, she was really the one responsible for Methodism. Sometimes she's called like the mother of Methodism. Folks say that Methodism really started with her, not necessarily with John Wesley, because of her methodical methods, not methodical methods, that's redundant, but her methodical style
Yes.
of raising her children in such a godly fashion and in such a strict fashion really planted the seeds in John Wesley's heart and his brothers and sisters, those seeds of piety, of
Yes.
understanding that, following Christ is something that should be experienced as well.
Yes.
On a daily basis.
Exactly. And that actually came to be one of the tenets of Methodism, that Christianity was supposed to be an experience. It's a heartfelt religion, not just an intellectual assent to certain doctrines and beliefs.
Right.
Yeah. And so as we move on from there, John, after the age of 10, he actually starts to go to private schools, and he ends up going to Oxford College, graduating from there, moving on to do his master's. When he leaves and graduates from Oxford, his brother Charles Wesley goes into Oxford, and when he's there, he actually starts this small Bible group in the college. And afterwards, he invites his brother John to come back and to lead this small Bible group. And this group had a lot of basic things or traits or characteristics that defined them. They were going to be interested in doing a lot of social work. They were going to be very strict in their disciplines with the Bible,
Social
with
work
prayer.
meaning like visiting the prisoners,
Exactly.
feeding the hungry, clothing the naked.
Exactly.
They were very meticulous about this. This is what we're going to do. We're going to be
Yes.
accountable to one another. So
Yes.
think about a group of people that just get sick and tired of living nominal Christianity or
Yeah.
just having this religious lifestyle, and they say, hey, you know what? Instead of depending on the church or the sacraments or whatever experiences we have in our separate churches, why don't we get together and form our own intimate group where we are accountable to one
Yes.
another, where we pray for and with one another, and we start getting involved in social activism.
Yes,
Now, social
exactly.
activism today is picketing and holding up signs and complaining about how the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. But in their mind, let's go and actually, put our money where our mouth is.
They're thinking about James and true and undefiled
Right, religion. Yeah,
right?
exactly. And that's what they're doing. So they're serving the needy. They had decided already to set aside a certain amount of money,
Yes.
as much as they possibly could, to do all the good they could do. And it's funny, actually, when you start, when you see paintings of John Wesley, he's got the long hair.
Yes.
You know? And in the 1800s, the men wore wigs. They
You
wore
see the white ones, right? The white wigs that they would put
powdered
on.
wigs, right? Including the founding fathers, George Washington, and these fellows, and Charles Wesley. But
Yes.
John Wesley, he didn't wear wigs. And the reason why is because that was even in his effort to try to save up as much money as possible. That's one of the things he did away with.
Wow.
He said, I could save the money that I use on going into the barber to cut my hair and buying wigs. I'll just save up even that, and I'll just let my hair grow long, and I'll just be clean. Because the whole wig thing came up because of ticks, like back in the lice, lice and ticks and everything in between. But he figured he'd be just as clean as he could possibly be. He's credited with the quote, "Cleanliness is next to godliness."
Right?
So I thought that's just a nice, cool little thing in parentheses that reflects how meticulous they were about money. I'm not going to wear wigs. I'm not going to the barber. I'm saving up that money so that I can give to the poor.
Yes.
So I just wanted to interject that when you use that phrase of social work or social activity,
We wanna
sometimes people
define-
don't,
Yes, yeah.
people in the church sometimes don't understand. And they also don't understand how passionate these men were.
Yes.
They were known as the Holy Club. I don't know if you
Exactly.
mentioned that yet, but
Yeah.
this is the Holy Club. And these men were really passionate about this, among whom were George Whitefield
Exactly.
himself.
Yes.
And it wasn't like what we see today, where people say, well, it's okay, I'll just take a small percentage of whatever I make and help the poor. No, these men were really passionate, and they were very committed
Yeah.
to this kind of accountability.
Yeah, they were very meticulous in terms of how they could save every penny, dollar,
Right.
cent to try to use it towards helping the poor and all of the works that they were doing. And like you mentioned, because of this method of serving God, they got nicknamed the Bible Moths. They got nicknamed the Holy Club. They got nicknamed the Methodists. And the name that actually ended up sticking with them and that they ended up choosing, just like Christians who were first called Christians in Antioch, but it was probably more of a mocking type of name than it was a good a description of them. So the Methodists took this and it became a part of who they were and their identity.
Which is why, by the way, those of us that read a lot of Wesley, you see a lot of the documents are entitled A Defense of the People Called Methodists.
Yes.
Or you see variations of that kind of thing, but that phrase pops up a lot, the people called Methodists. John Wesley used that a lot because this was before the time that they were officially, ecclesiastically called Methodists.
Yes.
John Wesley was saying the people called Methodists. And they were called that because of the things you say, and also just the personal piety. We're waking up at 5 in the morning, or we're waking up at 4 in the morning.
Yes.
We're going to pray. I forgot how many times they would pray a day, but it was very methodical.
Exactly.
You know, for example, at 3 o'clock we're going to pray again. At 6 o'clock we're going to pray again. I don't know
Yes.
really. Do
I
you
think
happen
it was
to know?
about 3 times a day that
Yeah,
they would,
something
and
like
they would
that.
come together on a daily basis in order to discuss even the
Yeah.
things that they were going to be doing and the whole accountability issue that you mentioned.
Method, and so they
Exactly.
were being called a Methodist as a term of derision, of mockery, as you say, until John Wesley said, "Well, we'll keep it.
Hey.
We're Methodists."
And so, after this happened, and they were there from the Methodist Holy Club started around 1729. And so afterwards, John Wesley and his brother Charles get invited to a colony in the Americas, the colony of Georgia. And they were invited to come and be ministers there. Not only John, but even Charles were actually ordained in order to be able to minister to the people there. When they arrive, I'm not going to dwell too much on this part of his history, but we will mention at least that from John Wesley's own journal, his own words, he did not see his time in the Americas as productive, as successful as he would have wanted, as fruitful. Things happened there in terms of relationships that didn't work out the way it was supposed to, and it was almost like he was almost run off or had to leave in order not to cause any more problems that was taking place there. We'll get back to this idea at the end when we start talking about some weaknesses and strengths of things that happen.
Can I just say in parentheses? Sorry to keep interjecting here, but
this is part of the. We spoke that we would do this. So.
A part of me is afraid that some people watching this might think that we're talking about an isolated case of some gentleman in the past, and they might be wondering, so what? What does it have to do with me? I do want to say that the people like Dr. Roger Olson says that John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards are the great-grandfathers of evangelicalism.
Yes.
So those of us that come from a Pentecostal background, or we're still working in Pentecostal movements, if you're a Pentecostal, if you are evangelical, and I know there's a lot of debate that goes on as to what exactly that means. How do you define an evangelical?
Exactly. Yeah.
But most of the folks I think that are in our audiences are either Pentecostal, or that's their tradition, or they're influenced by Pentecostalism.
Yes.
And these are like our forefathers here.
Exactly.
This is really where we come from, and you can learn a lot from interacting with these men. So you mentioned the trip to Georgia. Mm-hmm. Well, if you read the letter that John Wesley wrote, I forgot now who he wrote it to, but it's one of my favorite letters of his, where you kind of see where his mind and his heart were before taking his trip to Georgia.
Yes.
And he has this kind of romanticized view of what to expect when it comes to Georgia. I have the letter all highlighted, and it's actually one of my favorite letters when it comes to missionary work, even though you see some of his shortcomings in the way he was thinking. Like I said, the over-romanticized view.
Yes.
Oh, the Indians are like little children, eager to learn. They want to hear the gospel. And he sort of says something to the effect of, they haven't been ruined by anybody's teaching.
Yes.
Like those of us here in England, where they have their theological persuasions, and then you have to sort of undo whatever it is that they're thinking, so that then you can start all over and build another foundation. He says, not so with the Indians.
Yes.
They haven't been corrupted by anybody's theological lenses or their theological views. And so I'm going, and they're going to receive this. It's going to be great. It's going to be excellent. And so the reason I mention this is, I think those of us that are pastors, that are preachers, that minister, those of us that are involved in the church, we should read these men. You should read Wesley.
Yes.
You should read these letters.
Definitely.
Because oftentimes the failures in our own ministries can be instructed or can be avoided, I should say, by looking at the failures of men like Wesley. And I know you haven't gotten to that, but on his way back, from when that his ministry did not work like he wanted it to work in Georgia, and the same thing happened with Charles Wesley. They both left.
And Charles Wesley actually ended up leaving before his brother
first,
John.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he had a lot of health issues.
Exactly.
And when you read Charles Wesley's journal, it's amazing how depressed he was. And he was really mistreated also when he first came to Georgia. And he's complaining about the lice, and he's complaining about the
conditions were just
terrible, and his physical ailments, all these issues that happened. He left. And then John Wesley stuck, I don't know, was it a year or two max?
2 years.
2 years before he left as well. And, if you read how these men thought at the time, then you could pick up maybe certain views that you might have. And you say, well, you know what? I think I should have a more balanced view. One of the things I do like, by the way, about him going to Georgia in that letter is how there's two things that stand out to me in that letter, where he's sort of exposing his heart before he goes to Georgia. Number one is the idea of, I want to save my own soul first. Yes. And he says that explicitly. He says, I'm going over there because I'm starting over, and I want to save my soul first. And I love that. And I'm thinking, this guy was already an Anglican priest by the time he wrote this. And how many times do we think that way? We usually think, well, I'm saved. That's a done deal. Okay, I'm saved. Hallelujah. Well, do you revisit that concept? Do you have a healthy self-evaluating every once in a while to say, am I really saved?
Yeah.
Am I saved? Do I know
says,
Christ?
Examine yourself to see whether or not you are in the faith.
Right. Is the Spirit giving witness, testimony to you being a son of God? And so he's saying, I'm going. And you see in John Wesley, this man who says, if I need to cross the seas, which was a dangerous thing to do at the time, wasn't hopping on a plane
That's
and showing
right.
up 7-8 hours later.
This was not a 2 or 3 hour trip, guys. It's a couple of months, a few months.
In fact, he almost died on his way to Georgia.
Don't get into
right?
that. We'll talk a little bit about the boat trips.
Yeah. You see, or was it on his way? It was on his way to Georgia, right?
Yes, yeah.
So, and yet he was willing to make the dangerous trip because he's thinking, I need to save my soul. We're not going to get into that now, but there's a lot of discussion as to what exactly does he have in mind? What is going to save his soul? What's different in Georgia than what he was experiencing in England that would make him think, well, I can save my soul better there. I could be more holy, more sanctified there than here. And he does explore that a little bit in his letters. We're not going to get into that segue now. But it is enough to say, at least now, that if in his mind, saving his soul meant, I am leaving all. There's an old song that says, I'm leaving all to follow Jesus. I'm turning from this worldly way.
Yes.
And all I have is his today. Or I'm standing out upon his promise, and all I have is his today. You see that in John Wesley. I'm leaving, and I'm doing anything and everything it takes to save my soul. I'm going to do that. The second thing also is that I notice stands out from those letters is his willingness to say goodbye to commodities, to luxury, to those things that he loved. So a lot of times people look at his trip in Georgia as an utter, mere failure. And there's a recent book that came out. It's called John Wesley in America. I think that's the name of it.
Okay.
You could look it up. I think it's called John Wesley in America or some variation of that title. And I forget who the author is.
And they wrote a whole book on his 2-year...
They wrote a whole book, and it's new, fairly new, like about a year or two or three.
Is it a positive treatment of it, or it's more of a negative? Or
it's an academic.
Like,
it's an academic treatment, and I appreciate it because what this particular scholar wants to do, or what he does do very effectively, is he wants to question that whole idea about Wesley's trip being an utter failure.
Okay.
And so he says, look, Wesley calls it a failure later on. On his way out, he's questioning his own salvation, which you'll get to.
Yeah.
But that's a fantastic book because even if you disagree with him at the end, which I don't, I think the book really convinced me, like, you know what, that trip wasn't really a failure.
As bad as
it wasn't. And it's a scholarly treatise, so it's not like, it's my opinion. No, he's documenting things. He's documenting all these sorts of sources, and it's fantastic. I know it's published by Oxford Press.
Okay.
So it's super expensive now. If you can even find it, good luck paying for it. You might have to skip rent a couple of months before.
You might have to not get your wig done.
Yeah, no powdered wigs for a couple of months. But what I love about the book is that even if you don't agree, even if he doesn't convince you that Wesley's trip was not necessarily a failure, even if you're not convinced of that, at the very least, you'll walk away saying, wow, there is a lot that I can learn from that trip.
Yes.
And so those that are watching this and sort of asking, what's the point? Because I get that a lot. You've known me for years, and you know that I'm very passionate about Wesley, the Wesleyan Revival, and all of that. And I'm trying to spread this in Pentecostal churches where I have any sort of influence.
Yes.
And oftentimes I get a pushback from people that they want to categorize John Wesley as a great preacher and nothing more. He's a great preacher. He was, un siervo de Dios, gloria a Dios, an awesome servant of God. Well, yeah, he was all those things, but they don't really make the connection of this is a father of ours.
Exactly.
In the good sense. Jesus says, call no man, your father. But then the Apostle Paul also says, I'm your father, to the Corinthian church. And so, he is a father that we can learn from. And I like to tell folks, when folks ask me who's my mentor, I say, well, John Wesley. I don't know that he'd be so proud of me today, but I'm definitely proud of him, to say he's a father of mine, because you read his works, you read his letters, you analyze his life,
and
his
sermons. It's almost like having him there for real. And as you read, you get his mind, you get his thoughts.
That's the magic and the power of a book. Read as much as you can.
We're going to talk about that too.
I like to say, always have Jesus in your heart and a book in your hands.
Come on.
And the gospel on your lips. So when you read, Wesley, you're seeing a man that you can learn a lot from, even in the areas where you disagree with him. And we can explore that later if you like.
No, definitely. We're going to get into all of that. As you can see, this is the reason why we had to do a whole separate session about the Methodist and Wesleyan Revival.
Yeah.
And so, we see his time here in the Americas. And as he returns towards the time of 1737. The trip taking several months. He arrives back in 1738 to England. And one of the things I want to highlight before we move on to what happened then is on his way to Georgia, on the boat trip, there was actually a very, we can almost call them in one sense, a charismatic group that we would call, that were called the Moravians. The leader of this movement or group of people who were coming from Herrnhut, Germany, is Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. And so this group of people who were making such great emphasis on the need to be born again, on the new birth experience, and also the religion of the heart. They were on this boat as he was traveling to the Americas, and as David already alluded to, there was something that happened. Wesley mentions in his journals that he was actually observing their comport, and he was looking at how their behavior, their discipline, how many of them were very pious. They would do a lot of the work that even the servants and the people, the Englishmen on the boat wouldn't even do, and they wouldn't accept money. When asked why they don't receive anything, they said that it was good for their proud hearts to do such a thing, and that their Savior Jesus did even more. And so one day this big storm happens, the boat is tearing apart, and everyone is scared out of their mind that they're going to die. But Wesley observes this group of Moravians who are actually singing hymns at the time of this event, and he is totally mesmerized. And later on, he ends up talking to them and asking them, were you guys not afraid? And the person that he was speaking to says, no, we were, thank God we weren't. And he says, what about your children and your women? He was like, no, not even them. None of us are afraid to die. And so he gets to the Americas and he talks to a Moravian pastor who speaks to him. Now we're talking about returning back to England. Now, before we get to that, David, you wanted to add something there real quick?
No, it just sort of a little bit of a mini application there is that I'm instructed by the fact that these men and women, the Moravians, they had no idea that they were contributing to the creation of a John Wesley.
A monster.
Like we like to say. And I love that. It just impacts me because you never know who's watching you. They weren't trying to impress anybody. Exactly. They're trying to impress God.
Yes.
They're just being godly. And look what their godliness did. That was the catalyst.
Yes.
That was the first push that got the snowball rolling down the hill.
And
so
wouldn't you say too that it's a testament to Wesley's character that he was humble enough to speak and actually try to find out and learn from this group of people?
You could say that, but you can also say that he wasn't necessarily manifesting as much humility as later on, because he didn't really even tell them about his doubts. Later on when he's asked whether or not he's saved, he actually tries to skip around the issue a little bit. Before his Aldersgate experience.
Spangenberg was the pastor that he spoke to.
So I do see it as a sort of a humility, of course, to ask. But I see it more, I see humility in Wesley in other events of his life. In that one, I see more I'm instructed not necessarily by his humility, but by his care for the things that are of eternal value. That's where I would tell folks, do that.
Yes.
Find out. Search.
Yes.
Don't just say, well, I don't know what's up with them. Wesley was like, I need to know. What do you have that I don't have, and where can I get it?
Yes.
Because the other side of the coin is that Wesley was afraid.
Yes.
It wasn't just that, the Moravians were singing, and Wesley was like, wow, these people are just like me. No, that was not the case. He was ashamed. He said, these people put me to shame.
Yeah.
I'm fearing for my life, and here we are, these people, to God be the glory, great things he has done. And they're about to die. So great. Obviously that's anachronistic, because that was written in the 1800s, by Fanny Crosby. But you know what I mean? Like here in New York, by the way. But you get it. Like they're singing and they're worshiping God, and I'm instructed more by the Moravians than by Wesley in that particular regard, But we have to be instructed by that in both those ways. Be instructed by the Moravians that teach you this is how you go through a storm. If you're going down, go down singing.
Come on.
Sink singing. You know what I mean? People admire so much the Titanic the musicians that were playing. Oh wow, so that was so amazing. I mean, this was the original amazing Titanic here. They're about to die, and them and their children are praising God.
Even the children.
I love that. Yeah, I think of that from time to time when I'm on airplanes and it gets very turbulent, and I think, this would be the equivalent of it. And I do think of that. I say, wow, how do I feel? And I do feel fear in some very turbulent flights. And I think these men and women had to be such awesome.
Our equivalent to what they must have felt.
Yeah, and they had to be such awesome people to be like, we're going to die. I mean, we think of storms like what we hear here, but even there's some thunderstorms that kind of shake you to the bones. Like, wow, you just feel overwhelmed. And when you read Joseph Pillmore's journal, Joseph Pillmore was an early Methodist as well. He's not so well known. I visited his grave actually at the end of last year.
Okay.
Where was that in? I think it was, where's Asbury's, where you dropped me off? Philadelphia. Yeah. Well, he's there. Joseph Pillmore is in Philadelphia. Anyway, in his journal, he experiences a storm as well on a ship at the beginning of his journal, and that's well worth reading. It's like 2-page description of what the storm is like, and it kind of it's effective in showing you, like, this is no little thing. And he says, I had read stories of people saying that they were in the middle of storms when they were on a ship, and how everything would be pitch black. And there would be a flash of lightning, and in that flash of lightning, they would see mountains of waves in the distance. And he's like, I had long read of this, and he quotes a psalm, because these people were always quoting the Bible and stuff. And he says, and I have long read of this, but it wasn't until I experienced it that he basically says he feels the full fear and impact of that. And he also has a godly reaction to it. But as I read that, it's scary. You think, wow, in the middle of the sea, and it's dark, and there's thunder, and they were sure that they were going to die. And you have these people singing hymns. And worshiping the master of the sea.
Come on.
And they didn't even know that there was a man named John Wesley on that ship who was watching them, their behavior on that storm.
Which ended up influencing him. Look at that.
Yeah. Praise God.
Praise the Lord.
Hallelujah.
You never know who's watching you. Commercial break now. So we see that Wesley comes and returns back by 1738. He comes back. He finds out his brother Charles had been sick still, but was recovering, and had been in conversation with another Moravian named Peter Böhler. And Wesley begins to speak with Peter Böhler, and they talk on this new birth experience. And as they do this, Wesley ends up going to a meeting that he was invited to, which in his journals he mentions he was reluctant to even to go, but he ends up going. And
this is back in England.
Back in England, yes, back in England, May 24th, 1738. Wesley goes in, and these Moravians are having a small group Bible study, and they were reading the preface to Luther's commentary on the book of Romans. And Wesley begins to describe in his journal, and maybe you could actually quote him a little bit better than I would. I'll probably summarize it a little bit more. But can you tell us what happened at that moment when he enters in and he's hearing these words read?
Well, there's a lot of discussion as to what part exactly of the preface was being read, because it's a little long. But Wesley sort of hints at it when he says when Luther was exploring the whole concept of justification by faith.
And the change that takes place.
Right.
In the heart.
And so he jumps up to his feet and he shares. He felt compelled to share with the group that was there that he felt his heart strangely warmed.
Come on.
And he says, and I knew that my sins, even my sins, were forgiven. And I knew, that I was forgiven at that moment. And so he always attributed his conversion or his new birth experience to that particular event. And a lot of Methodists all around the world, we celebrate what's known as Aldersgate Day. Aldersgate Day. So at the time of this recording,
We're 2 days away.
We're 2 days away at the time of this recording.
Yes.
So this is obviously going to be a permanent thing online, and you might have missed it by the time you watch this, but every year it's celebrated. And May 24th is Aldersgate Day. It's a major holiday for Methodists all around the world.
And if you allow me just to interject here, and later on, we might even mention why is it that this is even important to know? Why should we remember and celebrate what God did in Wesley's life and Aldersgate Day? Hey, we should only worship Jesus. We shouldn't worship men. We're going to get to all of that because these things are important to our history, to our identity and who we are in Christ, and the things that we learn today and do today. Many of them come from people like Wesley, who has been such a great influence on our religious faith. Yep. And so now, this is something, I don't know what would be your opinion on it. There's many who would debate whether Wesley truly was born again at that moment when he mentions his heart strangely warm. I think that probably Wesley's idea was that there was a new birth that took place at that moment, even though maybe his mother or others would say, he was religious, or at least he knew Jesus and the word.
His mother did protest that, by the way.
Exactly, yeah. So, but let's just say that he was born again, 1738, May 24th. Yeah. And then afterwards, he actually goes away, and it's almost like he has like an Arabia experience like Paul, when Paul goes out for a few years into the wilderness. Wesley went and visited the Moravian Herrnhut community and was able to spend a few weeks there. He did not become a Moravian, and it was because of certain things that he saw, and also not only just practices, but even cultural differences. And it's okay to be different. It's okay not to copy everything just because you see something good in a person or a movement. God has your own identity, your own calling, and what God wanted Wesley to do would be a little bit more different, although the Moravians were definitely a great influence on his life, and we always want to honor those positive things that they were able to get. So he comes back. He again comes together with some of the people from the Holy Club or the Methodist Club, and now we're at 1738 New Year's Eve, and they're united together having an agape feast where they're together, they're worshiping, communion, all these things taking place. And then in the journal, once again, is described what happened. So by the time it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, they begin to express that this amazing presence and outpouring just came upon all of those who were present. Whitfield was there, Charles Wesley was there, John Wesley was there, and others. And as they were worshiping and praying 2 or 3 in the morning, the presence of God came down. It says that they were dropped to the floor. And by the end of this experience, they ended up standing up and saying, "Lord, you are Lord. God, you are our God." And so from this, we start to see the revival really beginning to step up after this. And Whitfield is one of the first ones who actually goes and begins to preach outside. And then he invites John Wesley. And from here forward, as they say, the rest is history. And so I want to just end it here, so that we can actually begin to speak a little bit about Wesley and some of the things that might have been his strengths and weaknesses. So after he comes out, he starts to preach. Thousands come to the Lord. He organizes his movement into, societies, bands, class meetings, circuit riders, and these groups in order to be able to disciple and raise up a whole generation in a movement that ended up not only affecting Europe, but affecting the Americas and affects us even to this day. And so let's talk a little bit, if that's okay, about some of the strengths and weaknesses that we find in the Methodist movement or the early Wesleyan revival. Okay, maybe we should start off by speaking his strengths, so that people know that we're not bashing Wesley, we're not bashing Methodists. So if any Wesleyans or Methodists watch this video, we honor what God has done through this movement, but we want to see some of the good things and the bad so that we can learn from it. So one of the strengths that, in my opinion, that I see from John Wesley, first of all, was his discipline, and the discipline that was within his movement and the structure. Another strength.
Well, you're talking about John Wesley, the man, right? Is that what you have?
Well,
primarily
I
in
kind of
mind?
I kind of mentioned both real
'Cause
quickly
when you
there.
say strength, I think of I have a lot to say about John Wesley, the man.
Okay,
But then I also
yes.
have a lot to say about something that's probably even more relevant, which would be his the strength of the impact he created, or you can also talk about the strengths of the organization that followed him.
Yes,
See, the
yes.
theological strengths and all of that. So I don't know which way you want to take it, but I do
Take
want to
it
say
either way.
that even while you talk, there's just so much information that floods my mind and my heart. And I do want to strongly encourage those that are watching this to not be satisfied with this video, however long or
Yes.
short it may be. Study or purchase some of these books. And let me just mention a couple of the resources that perhaps people
Sure.
might want to. So this is a little commercial break, but
Yeah.
I'm not making a plug-in here for any original works here of myself. But there is a book by Fred Sanders entitled Wesley on the Christian Life. Okay. It's part of a series by Crossway entitled Theologians on the Christian Life. And what they did is that they hired a different theologian that was a fan of different theologians in the past to try to present their works or their influence or their Christian worldview in a way that would be relevant for the Christian life today. So there's Augustine on the Christian life, there's Calvin on the Christian life, and whatever. Crossway is a Calvinist publishing agency, and so it's just awesome that they had a Wesleyan that actually presented Wesley.
He was just that awesome.
Yeah, they included him. But that's a fantastic book. If you really want to start somewhere, I would tell folks, Wesley on the Christian Life. It's a fun read. It's not super long. It's under 300 pages. It's 200 and something pages. And the writer, Fred Sanders, he's a really good writer. He writes with sarcasm and jokes and creative, rhetoric, and that's really good. So also the Sermons of John Wesley, and that was edited by Jason Vickers, I think, and Dr. Collins. Kenneth Collins. So that's the Sermons of John Wesley. That's a very thick book, and what it does is it takes John Wesley's sermons and it puts it in a Wesleyan Ordo Salutis, which means the order of salvation. Every theological tradition has an Ordo Salutis. So for Calvinists, regeneration precedes faith and that sort of stuff. So Wesley, since he didn't write a systematic theology, which we can say I would categorize as one of the weaknesses,
Yes.
or one of the decisions that I wish he hadn't taken. He didn't write a systematic theology, so that book, The Sermons of John Wesley, it basically does it for him. It takes his sermons and it puts them in a systematic theological fashion.
Yeah.
So that would be a close thing. Also, Thomas Oden. Thomas Oden has a 4-part series, and I think it's called Wesley's Teaching, or something like that. But just look up Thomas Oden, and you'll see there's a 4-part series. It has John Wesley's face in the front, and each part of that systematizes Wesley's teaching. If you want to have a more complete version of his works, then you get the Thomas Jackson edition of John Wesley's works, and that's 14 volumes of books. Some of them, the way I own it, it's in 7 books, so 2 volumes per book. And that was compiled in the early to mid 1800s by a Methodist named Thomas Jackson, and that's pretty much the most complete works of Wesley. It's not huge, and it's pretty inexpensive. It's about
And
you can
these
find it for
works-
like $100.
These works would include his journals, his sermons, or is
Journals,
it just
sermons, treatises, addresses, all kinds of his letters, all kinds of stuff. Now, the disadvantage of that is that the advantage is that it is a completed work.
Yeah.
The disadvantage is it is not the complete works. So it's a completed work, but it's not complete works.
In other words, we don't have everything.
We don't have everything that John Wesley has ever published.
Yeah.
Excuse me. That's why in the late 1900s, Abingdon Press decided to start publishing the much needed works of Wesley that would be the complete version. And that started in the 1970s, those publications. And that's known as the bicentennial edition. That's known as the works of Wesley. So you can find the works of Wesley, the Thomas Jackson edition, which are the 14 volumes. Normally you find them in 7 volumes, 2 volumes in each book, kind of a brownish kind of book. And that's inexpensive, about $100. I've found the complete set online. And a lot of scholars quote from that. But it's really incomplete.
Yeah.
The bicentennial edition has kind of a beige kind of color, and it's called The Works of Wesley. Those are very expensive. Each of those can be up to like $50-something sometimes.
Oh, wow.
And that work is not completed yet. Every couple of years, they come out with another volume. By the time they're done, I think there's going to be like 36. I think that's the projected amount of books. And just to give you a little comparison, just the journals alone in the bicentennial edition amount to almost the same amount of pages as the whole Thomas Jackson edition put together, the 14 volumes, which shows you how much is missing.
That says a lot.
Yeah, and the bicentennial edition has a bunch of helpful footnotes and corrections of some mistakes, some significant mistakes that are in the Thomas Jackson edition. So that's important. Get to know Dr. Vic Riesener's work as well.
Yes.
And get to know some of those early Methodists, Francis Asbury, Joseph Benson, Dr. Adam Clark.
Richard Watson.
Of course,
Yes.
Richard Watson, Thomas Koch.
Yes.
A lot of these early Methodists that are very important. So that's just rattling off a couple of John Wesley's works that I think you should get. I'm sure that I've forgotten a few, and I'm going to kick myself later for not mentioning it.
You know, I want to make a small parenthesis before we move.
By the way, also Calvin versus Wesley by Don Thorson, I think, or Tom Dorson, something like that. Think of Dorson or Thorson. And that's a really great book. Calvin versus Wesley is a really good one, too.
Awesome. Yeah.
You were saying.
And this is great. Thank you for even bringing up these resources in case you want to read. And this is the reason why I actually want to make a parenthesis before we continue talking about Wesley or anything. I want to just address a couple elephants that are in the room as we talk about these issues. So the first elephant is, what's the point of talking about Wesley? Why is it even important to be speaking about such a guy? You know, is it man worship when we start to do those things? And so we want to just address the reason why this is actually helpful and why we should actually learn and read about these things. And then if we can also make some comments, and I would love for you to comment, why it's even important to read, period, because a lot of us, as the Bible says, that a lot of us, perish for a lack of knowledge. And, reading is a way for us to be able to not only learn, but it also to grow as people and as a movement. And so can you just give us some of your thoughts? Is it man worship for us to be celebrating Aldersgate Day and commemorating the man Wesley or the Methodist movement? Why should they be watching this video? And let me just say this video is unscripted. There's no teleprompter.
No notes.
There's no notes. We're just speaking from our heart. So if we're going back and forth, I hope you just enjoy the conversation that we're having about Wesley and the Methodist revival that happened. So can you give us some thoughts about that?
Sure. Well, I do want to say that I'm oftentimes offended and very disappointed by people that oftentimes confront me using the kind of logic that you just described or alluded to. The kind of logic that says if you admire somebody of the past and you consider that person to be a mentor, or if you're learning from that person, or if that person in many ways has his or her fingerprints on your spiritual life, on your spiritual upbringing or development, that somehow that's man worship. I want to say that if it were man worship, then we wouldn't be doing it. We are Christians, or I like to say Christians. We worship Jesus Christ. I mean, how dumb can a person? What an unintelligent approach would it be for any Bible teacher to begin to worship any man on the same level with Christ? And we don't worship any man or any woman. We worship Jesus Christ, and we're not people that are making idols of these individuals. But I think that a very good case can be made biblically for studying the people that came before us. Exactly. The Apostle Paul himself uses his own national history in order to tell the Corinthian church, these things were written as an example to us, so we don't do the things that they did. And nobody was going to accuse the Apostle Paul as worshiping the Israelites. In that example, he's using them as a negative example.
Yes.
But he's still using them as an example nonetheless. He's still saying, look at what our forefathers did. And he quite clearly says, and this is written for our admonition, for our instruction. So biblically, and then also you have in Philippians where he says, imitate those who are imitating us, imitate those that are following us. In Hebrews as well, the author says that we are to take notice of our pastors, of our leaders, look at their faithfulness. In Hebrews chapter 11 as well, you have the famous Hall of Faith.
Exactly.
Yes. Where there's an analysis and evaluation made of people in the past. And there's a lot of verses that you can look at in the New Testament that show us quite clearly that not that there isn't anything wrong only, but that it's actually our duty to know those that came before us and to learn from them.
And then the Bible even tells us about even honoring those who are worthy of honor.
Right.
So honoring is not worship.
Yeah. Right, it isn't, and the other thing also is none of those verses say that the person necessarily has to be alive. You can honor those that came before. I think it's very myopic and a very anti-intellectual approach, and a very arrogant one, to say the least, to think that everything begins and ends with me.
Exactly.
You have a lot of people in the churches that feel like, well, I want to do my own thing. I met a pastor once, and I said, well, what commentaries do you read? He says, I don't read commentaries. I don't listen to these preachers and all that because I want to study the Word of God, and I want God to give me, my own revelation, if you will. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I did ask the pastor, I said, well, let me ask you, after God gives you your revelation, do you share it with anyone? And when you do you expect them to take you seriously? And the pastor was actually kind enough to actually think of that and say, you know what, I didn't think of it that way. Because he knew that if he told me, well, of course, I'm a pastor. If I study and God gives me something, I give it to the church. And I was telling him, what would you say if the people in your congregation told you what you just told me? No, pastor, I don't want to hear you because I want to study the Word of God by myself.
Yeah.
So it's just unintelligent. It's an anti-intellectual, unbiblical, and an unhelpful way of dealing with church history. Yeah. We have to know that who we are today is we are standing on the shoulders of giants that came before us.
Yes.
Historians have quite often said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And so we study the life of the early martyrs. We study the life of Justin Martyr. We study the teachings of the early Greek fathers and see how they thought. Right,
apostolic fathers.
Yeah, and nobody thinks that we're worshiping them. I suppose you can worship people and fall into idolatry, but you can do that with anything. You could worship television.
That's right.
Some people, I think, that say these very same things are worshiping anti-intellectualism. They worship ignorance. So worship is not a matter really of whether or not you're studying people. The problem is people are anti-intellectual. They're lazy. They want to have this very hyper-pragmatic approach to the Christian life that's hyper-experiential and very subjective, and they just think that God, by osmosis, is going to grant them some supernatural revelations, But in Luke chapter 1, Luke tells us that he writes his gospel based on Studying.
Research.
Research. That's right.
We
He
put it in our
goes-
terms, research.
Yeah, because he was not an eyewitness to the works of Christ. So he went out and he interviewed people. And he says that. He didn't have to hide it and say, well, oh my gosh, when they find out, Theophilus is going to find out, I haven't written from supernatural revelation. And yet we still consider that to be inspired writing.
Yes.
So not to go on off in a tangent here, but this is an important question that you bring up. Because I have to deal with it all the time. People say, you mention Wesley all the time. You mention Wesley all the time. Well, of course I do. Some people admire rappers, and some people admire gangsters. You know, some people, you admire the wrong person and you get judged for admiring the wrong person. You admire the right person and then you get criticized for being an idolater. You just can't win with some people. And so what I'd rather do is I'd rather present a case biblically. I'm writing about this. I'm writing a sermon on sin. And at the beginning, I sort of explore a little bit this concept here of learning from those that came before us. So it is important to study John Wesley, and it is important to study John Wesley, especially if you're a Pentecostal or if you consider yourself an evangelical.
An evangelical, Pentecostal, charismatic, third wave, wherever you want to take it.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's because in many ways he blew open the door to a lot of the things that a lot of the perspectives that we have today that we think were so original. And it actually started with Wesley.
Yeah.
Congregational singing, as we know it today, was heavily formed by Methodism. Methodists, the early Methodists were known as the people that sing their faith.
Yes.
You know, and you read a lot of documents of the time that in many churches, one person sang and the others, remained quiet. And so the Methodists started inviting the whole congregation. Let's sing together, sing lustily, sing loudly, sing with passion. And a lot of our practices today are influenced by Wesley, the emphasis on holiness. That comes from the Wesleyan Revival, at least our particular brand
Exactly,
of holiness. Holiness is taught in the Bible, of course, and Puritans believed in it and all of that. But I would say the number one thing is soteriologically speaking. So in soteriology, which is the study of salvation, there you see Wesley's fingerprints all over. Because the Reformers did not have an Arminian perspective. James Arminius, or Jacob Arminius, however you want to say it, he was a theologian that lived in the 1500s, and he basically parted ways theologically in terms of Calvinistic soteriology.
Or predeterminism that
Right.
many Calvinists would say came all the way from Augustine, and he parted from that,
Yeah. It comes from Augustine, but not before. Augustine, but not before, Scripture came before Augustine, but, that's important because after the Council of Dort, you have the banishing, and look all these things, Google all these things we're talking about. We don't have time, we don't want to bore the audience either. But after the Council of Dort, you have the Arminians pretty much banished and villainized and Satanized, and Arminianism, or Arminian soteriology at the very least, took a backseat to Calvinistic soteriology. And that type of monergism taught by Calvinists was really at the forefront of theological teaching at the time. And it wasn't until about roughly 200 years after Arminius that John Wesley comes and he fans the flames of that kind of Arminian theology.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, amen. I praise God for that all the time, you know.
Yes.
But the thing is, the people sometimes in our churches, they're so pragmatic, they're so untheological, they don't care about theology, they want to be practical all the time, and they end up not even appreciating these matters that are so important. Do you think Jesus died for everyone? Yes or no?
That's right.
Do you think that God saves monergistically, which is that he chooses those he's going to save and then he imposes on them this sovereign salvation where he regenerates them
This
against their
irresistible
will?
grace to draw them, and
That's the fourth point of the 5 points of Calvinism, And you ask anybody in our church, do you believe these things? And they're very quick to say, no, I don't believe in all those things. Well, what do you believe in? And inevitably, they'll describe a form of Arminianism. And I'll tell them, well, do you know what you just described is Arminian Wesleyanism?
That's right.
Now, Arminius wasn't abundantly clear as to whether or not a person can commit apostasy. To use popular jargon, whether or not a person can lose their salvation. I don't like using that terminology, but so people can understand. And in the Pentecostal churches, they're quick to tell you, no, of course a person can lose their salvation. And I tell them, well, do you know that the hero of that kind of thinking really is John Wesley? So while they attack me for being Wesleyan and mentioning Wesley so much, at the same time, they borrow so much of his theology in order to attack him.
Yeah.
It's just ignorance. People are afraid of what they don't know. They're afraid of what's new. They're lazy. They're untheological. They're anti-intellectual, and they don't want to. They don't want to have that kind of work or responsibility of having to be a learned individual in the church.
If you don't
It's
allow me
unfortunate.
to just add to it, because he's given the biblical argument from the standpoint of we can learn from history, and here's another biblical standpoint, which is Jesus instituted teachers in the church for the building up of the body. Did you
good one.
know that every book is actually like having a teacher there that's actually showing you and developing themes, ideas, texts, exegesis from different passages in Scripture and ideas that we need to be able to understand. So it's important that you also understand that every person that you study, like in this sense, we're talking about Wesley. Every person we study, every book that you read, it's like allowing the gift of teaching or the teacher to be able to instruct you so that Jesus may continue to build on or build up his church. And so if you say, we don't want to read other man's commentaries or other man's thoughts, or we don't want to, look into what this person said or what this person did, then we're also cutting off an arm from the body or from ministry that's supposed to help build us up in our faith until we're able to all reach unity in it. And so it's also important to look at it from that standpoint.
There's that Latin phrase ad fontem, right? Or is that in fontes? Ad fontes. Back to the fountain, back to the source. And just like an American that wants to not read the Constitution of the United States, not be aware of who George Washington was or the founding fathers were. An American that divorces himself from the foundations of this country is an American that is at a disadvantage.
That's right.
He or she's at a disadvantage because then somebody can come with I don't know, you name it, socialist ideology and say that's how America should be run. And this individual who has remained willfully ignorant of the nation's founding history won't be able to defend himself or herself, and will have to find other cheap methods of dealing with such a debate, usually villainizing the opponent or running away, ad hominem attacks. And so I think that the same thing happens with those of us that are in the church today. John Wesley was a brilliant theologian, a powerful teacher who had a lot of insight to much of what the Bible has to say. And I think the more you know Wesley, his thinking, his theology, his ethics, his emphases, the more you know that, the better of a position you're in order to understand your own foundation, your own, especially those of us that are evangelical.
Yeah.
You think Jesus died for everybody. You believe in prevenient grace. There it is. It's all in Wesley. See the things that he dealt with. See his logical, biblical, even oftentimes philosophical way of dealing with biblical passages, and learn from it.
Exactly. Yeah. And just for us to bring a balance to this issue, we're not here saying that John Wesley was inerrant. Or that he was infallible, and so whatever Wesley says is gospel. What we're saying is
he would say that too.
Exactly.
He would agree with what you just said. He would say he's not.
Of course he would. He was biblical. We have to judge everything through the word.
Homo unius libri. He writes that at the preface of his sermons.
Okay.
I want to be homo unius libri, a man of one book.
That's right.
A man of one book. Oh, give me that book. And he's talking about the Bible. He had a high view of Scripture.
Yes.
So it wasn't that we're looking at John Wesley as if he were some sort of evangelical pope.
Exactly.
Not at all.
No.
And I disagree with a lot of things about Wesley. I shouldn't say a lot, but I disagree with some things about Wesley as well.
Exactly.
Some of his political views, for example. He criticized the American Revolution. I think Wesley was wrong about that. A couple of things about his life as well, I think sometimes are a little too extreme for my taste. So you can disagree with these men. But to be accused of being a Wesley worshiper,
or
I think is ridiculous.
Exactly.
And I do hear it. I gave a conference about this in Cuba just a very few years back, and this woman walked up to me after I had given this whole conference and asked me specifically that, I want to ask you a question, and I can just feel that she was coming already from an offensive position and sort of arrogant. And she said, who do you follow? Are you following man? You keep mentioning Wesley. And I asked her, I said, do you have a pastor? She said, yes. I said, I want to ask you, is he a man? ¿Es un hombre? I told her. And she said, yes. Do you follow him? Or are you a disobedient sheep? The conversation ended right there. Literally, she did not want to engage in dialogue.
That's right.
Literally, she turned around and left. And left me with the word in my mouth, the question in my mouth. She didn't even want to deal with it.
Yeah.
Because I was basically highlighting her faulty logic.
Exactly.
Are you following man? Well, it depends. What do you mean? Do you mean, worshiping Wesley as Lord Wesley's my savior? Of course not. That's ridiculous.
Of course.
But I don't know anybody who does that.
Exactly.
But am I following man in a sense that I think that he's a good example of what it means to be a Christian? Of course I'm going to follow him.
And this is the reason why we just wanted to make sure that we bring this balance, because we also want people to see that as we're celebrating and rejoicing and speaking so positively about this man and this movement, it's also don't look at it as if we are oblivious or that we are ignorant of the fact that he is a man,
that we're gullible.
Exactly,
we're gullibly just reading what he wrote and following
we
it.
want to learn. We want to get closer to Jesus. Jesus is the one we worship. We want to get closer to him. And if there's men and women in our past who were close to him and can teach us things from their way of living and the things that they taught, praise the Lord. Even Wesley did that with Zinzendorf. He learned what he wanted, and then he took it. God led him with whatever else he needed to go. And so we're doing the same thing here.
I think getting back to the question that you had asked, I think some of that has been answered even in this back and forth about the strengths. And I think one of the strengths was a theological strength. The bringing back Arminianism, I think, is very important to me.
And before you continue, because it... connected to what we were just speaking about, another strength would be in the topic of reading. He demanded from his followers or his circuit riders and those who were his lay preachers that they were to, I saw what they're supposed to read even like 5 hours a day. I mean, this guy was, serious about this. So this was definitely a positive of the movement.
Yeah, he said that he would rather cut off his right arm than to have an unprepared preacher behind his pulpit.
Wow.
And then a woman told him, Mr. Wesley, God does not need your Oxford education. And he said, nor, madam, does he need your ignorance. So he was tough, He also uses a little bit of diatribe in one of his documents that he had all of his leaders read. And he says, you must read. He said, read whether you want to or not. And then he sort of uses diatribe and sort of quotes them. And it says, but we have no taste for reading. And he writes back, contract a taste by use or return to your trade.
Come on. Oh, I love that quote.
Contract a taste by use or return to your trade.
Quote.
That's awesome. I'm like, that's right. There's a lot of implications there. One of them being that if you don't like reading, you can start liking reading. There's a lot of things that we didn't like as children. Most children don't like vegetables when they're growing, and now I can't get enough of them. There's a lot of things I didn't have a taste for growing up, and now I do. I like it. And you say, what happened? Well, a piece of broccoli is composed of the same material as it was when I was little. Broccoli's taste hasn't changed at all, but I changed.
That's right.
So we can develop appetites that are helpful and that are useful. Now we have to work our way and build our way up to that. If you don't go to the gym, you're not going to go to the gym one day and try to bench press 100 pounds. You start off with something light, but you work your way there, and you may very well get to a point where you can easily bench press 100 pounds and then add to that,
That's right.
more weight later on. Same thing happens with books. A lot of people feel that I have no taste for reading is a legitimate and a sufficient response. I like to say an excuse. And it isn't. It's not, because you can actually learn to read, you can learn to appreciate it, you can develop, you can contract a taste by use.
Exactly.
So that's definitely a strength. Wesley was a well-read man, and he didn't just read theology. He was familiar with the classics. You see him quoting Milton's Paradise Lost. He quotes that a lot. He quotes Cicero, and he quotes ancient historians and ancient poets, and he knows ancient philosophers, and you see him criticize, Aristotle and Plato and all these folks that he read. And in fact, he was so passionate about people reading that he published or brought back into print many books that were not of religious nature, but they were classics, and he felt that they would improve society. So he brought them back into print, and sometimes he brought back versions of those because he knew, for example, in the case of Milton's Paradise Lost, he knew that his society weren't going to be beating down the doors of publishers because they want to buy Milton's Paradise Lost, but he knew that if he had a version out there that people can see his name attached to it, that they'd say, oh, this is John Wesley's version of it. Wesley was famous enough by the time that it would give credibility to a lot of these books.
Yeah.
And they would start reading again. So he brought back a lot of reading.
Can you speak to us about Wesley's holiness, his idea of Christian perfection, even his very own life?
Yeah.
In terms of holiness and godliness. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Excuse me. That's a very profound topic. We can have a whole other 2 hours about that, But I'll put it this way. I think John Wesley's holiness can be described or summarized in one word, and it is holistic. Holistic. And what I mean by that is John Wesley, he did not deny the Reformed thinking of holiness being something that's declared over us. So he didn't deny that. A judicial holiness, if you will, where God declares us separated, consecrated. You see that in Romans 1, where it says we are called holy, right? Or in 1 Peter chapter 2, where he says you are a holy nation.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
A lot of times Wesley gets misunderstood in that aspect, and they think, oh, Wesley didn't think that we are already holy. He did. What he did also is he was complex enough to also have the other aspect of holiness, which is the holiness that is a holiness attained throughout life, of growth. So there, we are declared holy. We are declared God's property. We're declared separated, and in that sense, we are already saints. But Peter didn't have a problem with calling us a holy nation, and in the chapter before saying, "Now be holy, because He is holy."
Exactly.
You say, "Well, which one is it? Are we holy, or are we to be holy?" Well, they go hand in hand. It is because we are declared holy by God, we are declared His property, separated for His use. It is because of that right stance that we have in Him that we are now able to live out that holiness in a practical, ethical sense. So John Wesley's holiness is a holistic holiness.
Yes.
See? Because it touches all the various aspects. John Wesley is famous for saying, one of the things he's famous for saying is there's no holiness except social holiness. He says that at the preface of his hymns. There's no holiness but social holiness. And what he meant by that is that holiness is not something that is necessarily manifested, incubated, and grown in an individualistic sense. We are to be holy as individuals. Yes, we are. But God has not called us to be holy in some holy corner of some holy church, in some holy aloneness, but rather that holiness is actually supposed to be made manifested in every area of our life. So John Wesley had a view basically that said holiness is, if you ask Wesley, how do you define holiness? He would say it is the restoration of the image of God.
Awesome. Beautiful.
We are made in what the old theologians called the imago Dei. We're made in the image of God. But that image, it's still there. I think it was Dr. What's the one that wrote on inerrancy? Norman Geisler.
Okay.
So Dr. Geisler had said that the image of God is not erased, but it is effaced, right? And that's a good way of putting it. Like a coin that you find on the floor. We've all seen coins that were so filthy or rusted that the image on the coin, you see a dime or you see a penny, excuse me, and the penny looks white almost. You can't see Abraham Lincoln on the penny anymore. Well, the image is there. It's not gone. It's just full of so much rust and muck and filth that you can't see the image. So in a very real way, all of us are made in the imago Dei. We're made in the image of God. And God saves us. He's not going to sanctify what has not been justified.
Yeah.
So in order to be sanctified, the first thing you need to be is justified. The penny needs to belong to God in the first place.
Exactly.
If the penny is in somebody else's pocket, God is not going to reach into Satan's pocket and pull out the penny and say, give me one moment, I need to restore the image. He's not going to do that. He only restores the image of the coins that belong to him. And that's really good terminology to use because Jesus did say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's, And
using a coin.
Using a coin, So we're made in the image of God. His image is stamped on us.
Yeah.
But basically, I appreciate John Wesley's approach to holiness because it isn't holiness that is merely from a reform, and I'm oversimplifying the reform perspective, of course. They're brilliant theologians, John Calvin with his Institutes of the Christian Religion and so on and so forth. So I don't want any reform brothers here to get upset. That's not how we look at holiness. We believe that it's progressive as well. Yeah, we do understand that. But Wesley emphasized that in a way that was, I feel, very unique to him, where he says, now that the coin belongs to God, let this coin be holy, so let him scrape off all the filth so that his image can be seen. And since Christ is king of everything, since he died on the cross, everything belongs to him, let us go everywhere where there are the effects of sin, and let us rid the world of the effects of sin. Let's rid the world of it, which that is very unique. That's where the social work comes from.
Yeah.
So he would say, what's happening with poverty? Well, there's economic, political, social reasons as to why poverty exists. He does tackle those things. So he does have political treatises where he writes about certain things that the nation should do in terms of their budget. And those are really fun to read, by the way, because even there he can't hold back from mentioning Christ and God and all that stuff. It's really good. But those are political tracts that are written for the king and the king's men of the time and for political discourse in the 18th century, in the 1700s. He does attack the problems, but ultimately Wesley's saying, you know what the problem is? Sin.
That's it.
So let us go wherever there is poverty. Let's see poverty as a manifestation of sin. Now, don't mistake that for meaning the person who is impoverished is
in sin.
Is in sin, and that's why he or she is in poverty because of his or her sin. That's not the point. It's the existence of sin in the world.
Yes.
But Wesley went on to say, you know what? Christ is king, and we are his ambassadors. So let us go everywhere and reverse the effects of sin. Prioritizing everything, of course. So the first and major effect of sin is separation from their creator. Let's fix that. But let's not stop there. After they belong to Christ, let us now pursue the eradication of poverty. Let us pursue the eradication of sickness, of injustices, of filth, all the little things and big things that were wrong in his society, he attributed it to sin.
Yeah.
And said, now that we're holy, let's holify all of society. Let's have a holistic approach that says, no, Christ is king. So he opened up the first free pharmacy in England.
Wow.
He opened up loaning agencies where people sometimes couldn't get a loan from the bank, but they were able to go to the Methodist and get a loan with zero interest, by the way.
Come on.
Just pay back whatever you got. And by the time the Great Awakening was well on its way, by the end of the 1700s, you had hospitals that were reformed, prisons that were reformed, orphanages that were open, pharmacies, clinics, free medical clinics, because he felt that there were doctors. He really says this explicitly in some of his sermons. I think especially in the use of money, Sermon 50, by the way. He does mention how he felt a lot of the people were sick because doctors kept people sick so that they can keep on coming back and wasting money on their services. Boy, how things have changed. And so what he do? He opened up free clinics everywhere, and then he wrote his book entitled Primitive Physic. That is a great read. If you haven't read it, you should read it. Where he puts basically home remedies there, and a lot of it is craziness, like healing for baldness. Put honey and rubbed with a piece of lemon, or I don't know what in the world it was. So you read a lot of it, and you feel like a lot of this is really primitive, and it's probably inaccurate. Who knows? Maybe some of it is dangerous, but. In his day, he was respected enough that he used his fame and he used his voice to address something that many people, quite frankly, in the church today don't care about.
That's right,
They say, well, people are sick. Well, we'll pray for God to heal them. Amen. Let's do that. But do you really care? Mm-hmm. Do you really care? I think sometimes God might withhold certain things because of what it teaches us. You might have a different view on that. But like, if God really wants to train the church in being loving, I can see how God can heal somebody next week instead of immediately right now, especially if he's trying to deal with the church's lack of love or lack of patience, or, what are you going to do? If I don't make it so easy where I'm supernaturally healing everybody, what are you going to do, church? Sit back and say, oh, well, we couldn't do anything. Or are you going to get this person a better bed? Because the bed that they're on, where they're bedridden, is dirty and it's not healthy for them. Are you going to go that far? And what a lot of people in the church end up discovering is that, wow, I really didn't have a heart for this in the first place. So social work is directly connected to John Wesley's holiness thinking. The apple has fallen far from the tree today in terms of the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
Many in the Methodist Church. But that's how I would pretty much summarize John Wesley's holy
So you
theology.
tell me if I'm hearing you
theology of holiness.
If I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying his view on holiness is holistic with a W, holistic,
Yeah.
okay, complete, because he's looking at different angles and not just holiness from one angle. So we're talking about a judicial holiness where we're declared not only justified, but we're separated unto God.
Yeah.
So as some would even call it positional sanctification, right?
Right.
Then we have, you're saying also an issue of character. He would see that as part of it, but he would also look at social issues as a part of what it means to be holy and being able to address those things.
Yep.
Correct?
Yeah, and there's no such holiness as social holiness. That's what he meant by that.
Okay. All right. Awesome. I want to address something that also a lot of people might not know. And it's something that at least to Pentecostals and charismatics matter a lot more in terms of, or better said, excite us a little bit more, which is the supernatural in the ministry of John Wesley.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure, and I myself, until I started reading about him, wouldn't know or think that God was doing in his time and through his ministry and his life supernatural things. Obviously, we're not going to call Wesley a Pentecostal or anything like that, but can you tell us a little bit about the supernatural side to the ministry of
Let me
the
ask
revival?
you, you're a pastor at a Pentecostal church.
Yes.
I want to ask you directly, why wouldn't you, there's an obvious answer, why wouldn't you call Wesley a Pentecostal? What do you mean he was he was not Pentecostal? He was anti-Pentecostal? What do you mean, Pastor? And what would you say about that?
Well, first of all, if I were to look at it historically, I would say, obviously, the movement started way after him.
Right.
And then also because the distinctives of what a Pentecostal would characterize their denomination as,
right.
I'm pretty sure he wouldn't call it a distinctive for himself. But in terms of the charisma of the Spirit, John Wesley definitely, the charismata, exactly. He was definitely someone who believed in the move of the Spirit and allowed it. Although he also was also very cautious to make sure that it didn't move too far into emotionalism. Even though he also made sure that it's okay to be emotional.
Yeah.
So so definitely, yeah.
Wesley wanted to avoid a cold dead religion, But thanks for answering that, because a lot of folks, they don't understand. What do you mean? Why wasn't Wesley a Pentecostal? And I would focus more on the easy response you gave, which is the first one. The second one is more complex, and I wouldn't want to drag somebody into having a conversation with me about that. But the first one is really important, that to call Wesley a Pentecostal is to speak anachronistically. It's an anachronism. It's out of the chronological order of history. The Pentecostal movement didn't occur until the early 1900s, and so Wesley was from the 1700s. So he's a proto-Pentecostal. He's a pre-Pentecost Pentecost. When folks say, "Well, why don't you read the Pentecostals from the 1700s?" I say that's what I'm doing when I read Wesley and the Methodists. The Methodists were the Pentecostals of that time.
Yep.
And the case in point is what you mentioned here, which by no means are we saying that Pentecostals have a monopoly on the gifts.
Of course,
Lots of folks believe in the gifts of the Spirit that are not Pentecostal, like myself.
Of course.
But the supernatural I wouldn't just say with Wesley, but the Great Awakening is important. And I would want to stress the fact that not just with Wesley.
Yes.
Because what you have is a lot of Calvinists, a lot of Reformed people today that tend to be cessationist. Not all of them. Thank God for those like John Piper, Don Carson was an incredible scholar or Sam Storms. They're all Calvinists, and yet they're continuationists. So praise God for that. But because at least on that side of the fence, there's some that would unite with us in fighting cessationism
and be more biblical.
And be more biblical. Yeah. I would agree with that.
Sola scriptura, therefore continuationist.
That's a good way of putting it. So that is important, and the reason I mention that is because the Reform guys oftentimes just want to tack on continuationism as something that's merely Wesleyan. But George Whitefield, was a contemporary of John Wesley, and he was a hardcore Calvinist, and the supernatural would happen in his meetings all the time.
And if you remember,
so this was a move of God.
Whitefield was criticizing Wesley because of these emotional manifestations and things that were going on until it happened in his own meetings.
See, I didn't know that. I'd have to think of that for a while.
So he criticized
and I love
Wesley wrote about it too. He's like, let us suffer for God to be able to run things the way he wants it, from here forward.
What's so interesting, by the way, I think you'd appreciate this, is I love the fact that between Wesley and Whitefield was the wild preacher, not Wesley.
Exactly.
So I tell the Calvinists, you guys had the crazy preacher, not us.
He was the shouting one.
Which I'm happy. I mean, I love Whitefield. That's amazing.
Course,
I think it would have been more fun to watch, Whitefield at work than Wesley. He would stomp. And there's people that felt he would die in the middle of his sermons. Like, that's how much of a frenzy he'd work himself up into. So the worst that we see in the Pentecostal movement of people huffing and puffing, we have to be very careful to make a distinction between homiletics and hermeneutics.
Yes.
You might not be a fan of somebody's homiletical approach to preaching, sermonizing, but if their hermeneutic is there, then you have to really give space to God to use people in different ways. Yeah. And Wesley says as much in his journal when he says, there's something a comment he makes is sort of a backhanded compliment to Whitfield, where Wesley is sort of saying, wow, I'm amazed at how God uses everyone differently, how God moves people that wouldn't be moved with an otherwise calmer and more organized discourse. You know, it's Wesley's backhanded compliment to Whitfield, and saying like, wow, this is amazing how God is using such wild behavior to lead people to him.
Yeah.
And even Wesley was open to that. So that whole, the supernatural is a great conversation to have. But just make sure you remind folks that this is something that God was doing all across the board,
Yeah.
all across the theological spectrum.
Yes.
Calvinism, Arminianism, you know. But yeah, indeed, in terms of Wesley's ministry, there were many supernatural things happening, and I think you see this mostly in his journal. If you really want to get exposed to this, you read his journal. Or there's that little orange book. What's it called? The Supernatural Occurrences of John Wesley. Is that it?
Supernatural Occurrences in the Ministry of John Wesley by, I think it's Daniel Jennings.
Okay.
I think he's the author of
It's
that
like an orange kind of cover, so you could look that up, and it's a thin. He combed through the journals and kind of
He chose a lot of categories of supernatural things like healings and exorcisms.
Now, two things I would want to mention. He used the Thomas Jackson edition.
Oh, he
so
did?
So
there still would be more stuff, in other
a
words.
whole bunch of stuff. Oh, much. So
Oh, my goodness.
that's one thing I'd say. So don't just depend only on that. If you had the time, read his journals. And the other thing I would want to say is that there's a lot of supernatural things that happen that aren't as explicit or as obviously supernatural. So he had to make the decision of leaving some of those out. So I've read things in the actual journal, like Wesley on his way to a town, but then he felt suddenly this compelling thing that would tell him, no, take this road, and he goes into that road and ends up in some other town, and he met a lady who was telling him, this is like in the third journal, oh, you know, I was praying for X amount of time to meet you, and like things like that. There's lots of stories like that are obviously and clearly supernatural, but he wasn't going to add every single one of those things. So he highlights the stuff that's more obviously, indisputably supernatural, because I guess the other things can be explained by providence.
Yes.
You know, mere providence. Which the providence of God is never mere, but you know what I mean? Like, you know, just they can be explained away in some fashion. But anyway, the supernatural occurrences in the ministry of John Wesley, that's a great book. But definitely his journals. You see exorcisms, you see Satan talking to him through people, even resurrections, you know, when sometimes riding his horse, the horse would die, and he would pray, and God would bring the horse back to his feet, and he would say, even this, you know, is this not a matter of prayer? He would say, and then he would pray, and God would raise up the horse.
Lord.
All these amazing things.
And you know what I love about Wesley is that it wasn't also as if he was seeking to encourage this as an end in itself. Which is sometimes an error that many of us can get into in wanting to work up the people into a frenzy or just seeking power. As David was preaching this, I'm going to put a link to his message. Seeking power for the sake of power. You know, it's for the sake of being a witness unto Christ. And so these things would happen as God honored the gospel message being preached, you know, and his evangelistic, you know, campaigns that he would do.
Yeah, that's a very important point you bring, by the way, because Wesley, I would go so far as to say, wasn't even pursuing those things at all. You said not pursuing them as an end in himself. I think it's safe to go so far as to say he wasn't pursuing them at all. He wasn't pursuing those supernatural things. And to be fair, there are occasions where you can almost interpret him as avoiding those things. In some of the stuff he writes in his journal and some of his letters. But he, by no means was he putting a stop to it and saying, oh, this is not allowed. He would preach. And what he would do in his journals is he would just report. And very often you see him say, the conclusion of the matter I leave to my reader. I'm just going to tell you what happened. And he'd write, right, I was doing this and that. The demon, whatever, said this. I am the devil. So-and-so was preaching. 10 people began to shake. These people fell, blah, blah, blah. And then he just leaves you hanging like, okay, so what happened? Was it God? Was it not? I mean, what was going on? Exactly. He's like, here, the fact of the matter I will plainly report. The matter of the conclusion I leave to my readers. You know, so you conclude. But then you see in other writings that he did believe God was working mightily through those wonderful things. George Whitfield says things like, like, daily Dagon falls before the ark, He would say things like that as he would report even in his journal the supernatural occurrences. And this, I think, is an easier pill for me to swallow than what I see in the modern church. And you and I are, we're a little bit different about how we feel about those things. That's good for our viewers to see as well. But this is where somebody like Wesley can be appreciated to somebody like me who's more on the skeptical side of things. Not that you're gullible or anything like that. You're an intelligent person. But, I'm more hesitant to, to be open to a lot of these things. And so I would commend John Wesley and the whole Great Awakening to those who have a problem with this. Read it, look at it, see the level-headed, mere facts approach. And I don't know if people know this, but or if even you knew this, Wesley actually had a personal policy of downgrading the report. Did you know that he would actually say, so if there was 34,000 people in this event, he says, he advises folks, put 30,000. He says, because I'm afraid, I don't want to exaggerate. And so he doesn't, and even like that, you see all these impressive, amazing things. So you're like, I wonder what it really was like. Because he had that personal, and it was public. And it's not like we can say, well, of course he'll say that. No, in his time, people could call him out on these things, call out his bluff. Wait a minute, what do you mean? But he's reporting at a time and publishing while he's alive, all these journals and these letters and things, sharing it with people that were alive in his time that could have basically corrected him and called him out on stuff. And from what we see, they don't do it. This is pretty much how it happened.
And I'm looking at all the things that you've been mentioning and that we've been discussing, and I see so many strengths in the life of Wesley and in the Methodist movement that we can learn from. We haven't even gotten into also even his own way of taking care of his physical body, his discipline in terms of, he even mentions in one of his journals why he thinks he's lived so long, in comparison to
Change
others.
Change of airs and stuff.
I would like us to talk, though, if that's okay, about some of the weaknesses in his life and in the Methodist movement. You've kind of alluded already to one of them. You mentioned him not writing a systematic theology. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. What I meant by that is I think one of the weaknesses, and understand, I'm not saying, I think let me repeat that. I think one of the weaknesses of the Wesleyan movement, the Great Awakening, is that Wesley did not produce a systematic theology. Now, don't hear me say, when I say that, don't hear me say Wesley was not theological.
Or that the Methodists don't have a systematic theology.
Correct.
Yes.
Because Richard Watson, thank God, fixed that for us. But that already came way after Wesley was dead.
Exactly.
I would have been very happy if John Wesley, during his lifetime, produced a systematic theology. And I find it to be a weakness that he didn't. And the reason why is because even when Richard Watson produced the very first systematic theology from an Arminian perspective, it's actually the first one in the early 1800s, even when he produced his systematic theology, he didn't focus as much on key distinctive doctrines of Methodism, for example, Christian perfection, which we haven't gotten into, and that's for another conversation. But he didn't really get into that as much. He does have a few pages, but very few in comparison to how much time he takes in his volume on other topics. And the reason this is a disadvantage is because later Methodists, and by the way, Dr. Ben Witherington feels that the reason Richard Watson didn't explore Christian perfection so much is because really that systematic theology was written for people who were already Methodists. And he wanted to strengthen them in the areas where they had to defend the Christian faith against deism and all sorts of other things, or Calvinism even. So you see him take more time in refuting those other doctrines in that systematic theology than he does on the distinctives of Methodism. And so Richard Watson probably thought, well, these are mostly, Methodists, so they are aware, they're familiar with these key doctrines of ours. They can read about Christian perfection in Wesley's writings and in some other writings that we have. And so I guess presumably he was saying, well, they're going to be reading all of the literature that's available, and this systematic theology is not for those key Methodist distinctives. It's also interesting, by the way, that he doesn't call it a systematic, what is it, Institutes of Methodism. He does call it Institutes of Christianity. Okay. I don't know if he calls it of the Christian religion, like Calvin's. I forget, but it's a variation of that.
Something similar.
Right. And so what that has to do with your question is that later on, this gave the impression to Methodists of later generations that perhaps doctrines like Christian perfection and a few others were not really that important.
Yeah.
And so then you end up seeing them loosen their grip on a lot of these things that they weren't familiar with Wesley's other works. And so little by little, until you have now guys like me who believe in the doctrine of Christian perfection, and then we have to go out of our way to walk on eggshells and present it in very careful ways lest we be misunderstood. Mm-hmm. I think all of that could have been avoided if John Wesley would have written a systematic theology, but he didn't, and it's pretty obvious that he never wanted to. He didn't have an intent. Now, the reason for that is not that he was not theological. You know, the reformers would love nothing more than to be able to prove that he wasn't really theological. In fact, Dr. Robert Godfrey has a series. He's from Ligonier Ministries, and he's a church historian, and he has a series on church history. And I love that series, but the particular episode that deals with the Great Awakening and deals with John Wesley, you know, I was like, all my antennas were up, and I was listening very carefully to how this Calvinist would present it. And in one of his throwaway statements, he does say, I don't think Wesley cared too much about theology. And then he goes on, and he did try to be respectful to Wesley, which I appreciated. I thought it was going to be a lot worse. But still, there were comments like that I don't like because, it's not true. John Wesley was very theological. Just read his writings. But he basically is to blame for a lot of these criticisms and characterizations of Wesley that they're not accurate. If he would have written a systematic theology, then I think that would have avoided all of that.
Helped in many areas. Clarified.
Yeah.
Certain
He didn't want to.
issues.
He said that his systematic theology can be read in the sermons.
In his sermons. Okay.
Yeah, so his thing was like, if a theology is not preachable, then it shouldn't be a theology. It shouldn't be held.
Now, one of the weaknesses that I brought up when I was doing a lesson on this revival was Wesley, and this is something that is always going to be brought up when talking about Wesley's weaknesses, was the issue that he had with women. And when we speak about that, he was not a womanizer. Yeah. He never was in adultery. What we're talking about is a failed marriage, or a marriage that didn't work out, not because he wasn't godly, but because of his lifestyle. And the issue that happened in Georgia, it happened again during his ministry, that Charles ended up talking to another woman that he fell in love with, and so then he quickly married Molly or Mary. And so can you comment a little bit on the celibacy or the should have been celibate ministry of Wesley? There was, let me put it like this. There was one person in the class who actually asked, how do we know that John Wesley maybe was actually called to be celibate, or to just live for God and not marry or anything like that? Just comment on that, if you can, on that whole issue with him.
Well, excuse me. First, taking a step back, I would want to say that we do have to tread softly when we're talking about those particular flaws, his unhappy marriage. And a lot of reformers sometimes are very, the young ones, the really young Calvinists are all too eager to point out Wesley's unhappy marriage. And they have to be careful, because George Whitefield also had an unhappy marriage.
Look at that.
Very unhappy marriage. So I think First things first, I feel no need to have to go out of my way to defend John Wesley. Okay, when it comes to this. He was a human being, and he made mistakes. But we also should not exaggerate things or make it out to be something that it's not. For example, John Wesley never had a divorce. Just by looking at that, that can be looked at as a success. You know, you had this woman that was miserable. Maybe he was a bad husband. Maybe she was a bad wife. I like the way Fred Sanders puts it in that book that I mentioned. John Wesley was a terrible husband, terribly mismatched to a terrible wife. You know? But then you have to ask, what does that mean he was a bad husband? He wasn't a wife beater. He wasn't. So sometimes we're so quick to jump to conclusions. You know, oh, he had a bad marriage. So that means there was some secretive thing happening here. No, neither one of them were unfaithful to one another. Neither one of them committed adultery. Neither one of them were irresponsible in those areas, and he never got a divorce, right? Now, that's not to code over things that are genuinely bad. I think John Wesley made a terrible decision in getting married in the first place. And I think a lot of it has to do with Charles Wesley, his brother, who's to blame. Wesley fell in love with one woman. Charles Wesley hurried up and married off that woman to somebody else, which is difficult to understand because we no longer have that today. We don't have somebody that has that authority to marry somebody off to somebody else.
And from what we can read, too, she was a godly person.
She was awesome, and they saw each other many years later, and there's evidence from people that were in the room and whatever that said, oh, my, this was the couple that was meant to be, you know? So Wesley,
thanks, Charles.
Thanks, Charles, for ruining Wesley's reputation. I forget if it was the first woman or the second woman that was the case. The second one, yeah. Right? The
first one was
or something like that. Well, I forget what it is, but so the first one was the Georgia one, right? Yeah. So you have somebody being married off to somebody else. Then you have the second one also being married off to somebody else. And the second one, I think Wesley was interested in marrying, in marrying her. So by the third time, you know, that Wesley has this accident where he slips on ice on London Bridge, and he's sprained his ankle, and he was bedridden. They took him to the house of this Molly, and she took care of him for a while, and she was a widower. Yes. She was a widow, and because she was a widow. Wesley, I think, also felt safer in marrying her because here's the other thing. See, this is where information is so important. You know, we can't be ignorant of these matters because folks say, oh, so maybe he was a bad husband. And I was showing somebody one time how Wesley was so strict about money, and they told me, no wonder his wife was miserable. Look how cheap he was. But see, you have to be careful to not leap to conclusions because Wesley on purpose married this woman who was a widow and already had a fortune because he felt she can keep her fortune and she won't be affected. Yeah, she won't be affected by my personal decisions on finances. He didn't touch her fortune and she didn't touch the fortune that he didn't have, you know? So she respected his poverty and he accepted the fact that she had. So he wasn't a bad husband in that area. But unfortunately, you know, when he got married to her, they both made an agreement that she would travel with him everywhere, and he told her, I cannot imagine preaching one less sermon after being married. And she said she accepted that, and she was all for it. And she traveled just a very short time. I forget how long, but it wasn't too long. And it wasn't until very soon she saw that traveling life was not for her.
Exactly.
And so she's like, well, let me stay home. And he says, well, okay, you can stay home. I won't travel with my wife anymore. And then that turns into a lot of other things where now she was jealous. You know, and she would receive letters that from women and sometimes that were written to Wesley, and he would write to them and give them spiritual advice. And she was very obsessive in her jealousy, and she would give a lot of his documents, his personal private letters to some of his enemies. She'd give it to them so that they can use it against him. So she did a lot of things that were bad, and he did a lot of things that as a husband you think, well, I don't agree with that, because that idea of I will not preach one sermon less after married being married, well, you have to, even if it's at least for a time period, at least for a honeymoon. But I think those are the evidences that show us that Wesley was not really made for marriage. When you look at it in a way, Wesley lived single his whole life.
Exactly.
Ken Collins wrote a book entitled A Real Christian about Wesley, and in one of the chapters he kind of alludes to the idea that Wesley might have never even consummated his marriage, which is to say he never probably even had sex with his wife, ever. Who knows, he died a virgin. It's like, so some of this dysfunction that you see there, I think it proves that perhaps Wesley was, not perhaps, but I'm convinced, this was a man that could have been single his whole life like Francis Asbury, and he would have spared us of a ugly stain in his reputation that we oftentimes have to defend. And another quick thing I'd want to say to the Reform group out there is that Charles Spurgeon wrote a thin biography about the Wesley brothers. And when Spurgeon talks about his marriage, even though Spurgeon criticizes Wesley in other things, he doesn't criticize him about his marriage. He criticizes his wife, which is interesting because this is coming from somebody who's not a Wesleyan. This is coming from none other than Spurgeon himself, who has every reason to try to make Wesley look bad. So even if a Calvinist Reform guy says his wife, and then Spurgeon says, if you can call her a wife, he says, and then he kind of bashes her. And then Spurgeon tells his audience, yes, Wesley has these stains, but before you throw the stone, just make sure that you're living on the level, the spiritual level that Wesley was living on. And then he ends his book saying, Wesley lived far above what all of us live. And he says that he feels like his own ministry is a candle and Wesley is the sun. And he's like, I'm embarrassed, in Spurgeon kind of hyperbolic, flourish speech. But he ends his biography that way, saying, I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed that I'm holding my candle up to the sun. So, I just tell folks, pipe down, relax. Yes, Wesley did have a miserable marriage, and we should criticize the decisions he made, but criticize the right things.
Yes.
Criticize that he got married in the first place. Criticize that he had a warped view of marriage from the beginning. Criticize those things. Don't make it out to look. Don't go out of your way to make it seem like Wesley was a hypocrite, that some
Exactly.
wife beater or something like that behind this. In fact, she was the one that seems to be physically abusive with him. On one occasion, he wasn't coming out to a meeting on time, and one of his little followers were like, what's going on? And they opened the door to his room, and they saw Molly dragging Wesley by his hair, which, it's sad when you think about it, because even John MacArthur, when he talks of Wesley's marriage, he quotes some other author, but he does say Wesley never knew the delights of the home, which makes people like John MacArthur love him more and admire him more. So it depends how you can take it. You can see it as what a hypocrite, blah, 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 which I don't think is good.
Of course not.
Or you can say, wow, like John Piper does as well. He says, how many people would give up in the ministry with this kind of difficulty? I mean, you're in ministry, and when you get home, the first thing you want to do is enjoy your wife and be ministered to. Imagine getting home, and it's a nightmare, and yet this guy was to the very end very faithful.
Godly, in every circumstance. Godly in every circumstance.
It's not a defense of him necessarily, a little bit, I guess you can say, but it's just trying to bring balance to a conversation.
I think that's the issue, which is bringing balance to that whole idea of him either being a hypocrite or him not being a good Christian, I guess, in this area. And I think that it has more to do with him making a wrong decision and jumping into something where he probably wasn't called.
Yeah, you can't be perfect, I guess, Mr. Perfection.
If that wouldn't have been there, we would have been the closest thing to Jesus, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what's so interesting you say, because a lot of people said he was as perfect of man as you can possibly get among sinners. And that's what one of the things, the point of that book, that biography, A Real Christian, is not to say, because we have a generation today that's like, oh yeah, they try to find the cat's fifth leg. They're so good at saying, oh well, these people can't be perfect, but and so there's an effort to mudsling
Yeah.
in order to bring people down. And I think that's a cultural thing because we see it even in America. You talk about how great George Washington was, Thomas Jefferson, and these greats. And now even in schools, there's just an inclination to try to cast these men in a negative light.
Slave owners.
Oh, these slave
yeah.
owners and all these things. Some of that is true, some of it is not, some of it is exaggerated, and some of it has a cultural context that it makes it more complex and more nuanced than we would prefer to see it as. And so I think that same cultural view sometimes seeps into the church, where even today, when you see somebody who's very godly, immediately the reaction that people have is to say, well, I don't want to be challenged in that way, so let me see what kind of defect I could find. And I've experienced that myself. I challenge people to a higher Christian life, and then I end up sometimes embarrassed because people then have an inclination to say, well, David is not that awesome because look at this, look at that. And if you want to find defects in me, you don't have to look too long or too hard or too close.
Yeah.
I'm a man, a broken man full of defects. And so was Wesley. But we do have to be very careful to not bring him down to our level when these are men that were really awesome. They were legitimately amazing men.
He was given over to Christ.
Yeah, totally. And there was another quick thing I wanted to mention about the marriage thing, and kind of slipped here. Well, I guess that's what can be said there about his marriage. I forgot, there was a point I wanted to bring about his marriage. Well, anyway, I will say that somebody in Buffalo, they felt uncomfortable, when I had mentioned, Wesley's bad marriage. And sometimes people are quick to then disregard his theology, or to say, well, what kind of person was this that... that's what I wanted to say. So you can edit this out. Let me pause.
Okay.
Another thing to say, by the way, real quick about Wesley's marriage is that oftentimes people are very quick to point at his bad marriage, and I want to say we have to be very careful, because we know, at least I know many people today who are very godly people and who are awesome men, and they have bad marriages.
Yeah.
They have a miserable wife, or women who are godly women and they have bad husbands, or parents that are great parents and they have bad children,
yeah.
or great children that have bad parents. Everybody's responsible for themselves, and we do have to be very careful to not smear somebody's character too easily or too liberally on the mere basis of the fact that they have a bad marriage. Lots of people in our churches, lots of heroes of ours, lots of folks that we admire and that are genuinely godly, and that they're great husbands and great wives, sometimes for many different reasons have bad relationships with their family on that level. So we just have to tread softly and be careful about that topic, I think.
I agree. And it's great that you were able to bring up this balance of how we're supposed to look at him, because he's done so much, and this is just a little small spot in all of the things that he's done. And I want to just end by summarizing some stuff about Wesley, and then I'm going to ask you if you can just tell our audience at least the top 3 things that if Wesley was here, he would want believers to do or to know. But just to summarize, Wesley, he was a revivalist. He, by the end of his life, he had ridden over 250,000 miles on horseback, which is equivalent to going around the earth 10 times. Okay, so just imagine the type of lifestyle he lived. He's written hundreds of books, thousands of articles and lectures and sermons. And he preached thousands of times. Thousands were awakened under his ministry or brought to the feet of Jesus. And even to this day, for those of you who might be in a Pentecostal charismatic church, I want you to know, or even in evangelical or anywhere where there's Arminianism involved, I want you to know that we find our roots, and even the holiness movement, Keswick, all those things, even though there's variations to what Wesley would have exactly taught, a lot of what we believe today, a lot of the practices we have today, we owe it to this man that God used. So we don't worship him, but we're honoring him, and how he affects us today. And so, David, if you would just, let us know what top 3 things would Wesley tell
Wow.
this generation of Christians today that would be the most impacting or that comes to your mind?
I didn't expect that. I'd have to think about that a little bit, but off the top of my mind, I think if I had to narrow it down to 3 things, the first thing I would say is Wesley would want to ask you, are you like Christ? That's the first thing he would want to communicate to you. Like, do you really know Christ? And oftentimes at the end of many of his sermons, there's like paragraphs of just questions. Is the mind that was in Christ also in you? Does the Spirit give witness or give testimony to your spirit that you are a child of God, et cetera? And it's like drinking from a fire hose, just this huge torrent, this tsunami that comes upon you of all these personal questions for self-evaluation. And that shows up over and over and over again in his writings. So I think if Wesley was in front of us, that's the first thing he would do. He'd ask you, is the mind of Christ in you? Is the heart of Christ in you? Are you like Christ? Is the Holy Spirit giving witness that you are a child of God? On and on. Have you victory over sin? He would just go on and on with that. And so that would be like the main point there. A second thing I think Wesley would teach us is what should be called Catholic spirit. Catholic spirit in terms of more of an ecumenical approach to how we do church. And that word ecumenical has become sort of a poisonous word now. Pentecostals, ecumenical, that's evil, that's of the devil. But we're not talking about syncretism.
With other religions.
Right. So we're not talking about syncretism. Let's mix Buddhism and all these other religions, with Christianity or whatever. But rather we're talking about a Catholic spirit in the sense of a more humble approach of what we can learn from other theological traditions. Wesley was really great with that. And if you have doubts about that, just read his sermon entitled Catholic Spirit. That's the name of the sermon. It's one of my favorite sermons of his, where he's talking about how we should make a synthesis. And that's really what he did with Methodism. He took from the Catholic church fathers. He took from Calvinists, from the Reformed, from the Puritans. He even took from mystics. You name it. He took from all these. Eventually, he dropped the mystics, of course. But he was trying to get, a consensus, trying to get to what he called primitive Christianity. Primitive Christianity, trying to get to the heart of this. In fact, that book I had mentioned a long time ago about Wesley in America, it might be called Primitive Christianity or something like that. But Wesley was always trying to get to the heart of that, and I think he would want us to think of that as well. Can you only learn from only Pentecostals? Can you learn only from those of your theological tradition? We have to be willing, able and willing to learn from one another. And so I think that's a criticism that I have, and I think Wesley would have, about what we see in many Pentecostal conventions and events, campañas, you name it. It happens in a small sense in our everyday life. It happens in a larger sense in who we invite to our churches, and then in an even larger sense in international conventions or national conventions or annual conventions where, we wouldn't invite people from other traditions. If you're going to talk about the sovereignty and the power of God, why not invite a Calvinist to stir you up? You're going to talk about social work, why not invite a Methodist? You want to talk about the importance of Bible study, why not invite a Baptist to teach you that? You know what I mean? So the first one is the mind of Christ being in you. Are you like Christ? The second thing would be the Catholic spirit, I would say, which is to say, how humble are you? How knowledgeable are you of interacting with and learning from other perspectives? And the third one I would say is true holiness. Is holiness manifested in your life? True holiness, Wesleyan holiness. That brand, he was a brand plucked from the burning, so he provides for us a brand of holiness, that I think we should learn from. That holiness that says, unfortunately, holiness is so warped now.
Yeah.
In our churches, holiness now is equated with, especially
External
with,
things, clothing,
Wesley
actions.
attacks external stuff too, but what I appreciate, this is what I got from him, what I learned from him. He says Christianity can't be about externals, but what Wesley has in mind when he thinks of the externals, he's actually thinking about the behaviors. Then he goes into the heart matter. I love that so much.
Awesome,
You see it
awesome.
like in his sermon, The Almost Christian. He's attacking the externals, and you're thinking, oh, that's right, externals, because we're used to thinking of pants, the Pentecostals that say women can't wear pants, you can't do this.
That's right.
But Wesley's not even thinking of that.
That's right.
If he's thinking of it at all, I don't think he's thinking of it at all, but if he is, it's like a minor thing. He does have a sermon on dress, but that's not even what he has in mind. And that's not the conversation, the discussions happening in his time. When
Yes,
they talk
that's
about
right.
external Christianity,
It's true, very true.
they're not talking about, dress or makeup. They're talking about externals of doing the right things, works.
Yes.
And even that, he says, it can't be that. It's got to be more deep. And I love that because that takes it to a whole new level. That's not just saying, well, because we're okay with telling people it's not about how you dress. It's about what you do. Wesley's like, it's not even about what you do. It's got to start deeper than that. What? Not only behaving the right way? He's like, yeah, it's got to be deeper. And then he ends up defining Christianity in that sermon,
Awesome.
The Almost Christian,
Yes.
as love for God, as faith, love for God, and then love for man.
Yes.
And that's where I put the holiness there. If you're really saved, if you're really regenerated, if you're really a believer, if you're really justified, then you must go on to sanctification. And if you're being sanctified, go on to perfection, like Hebrews 6 says.
There you go, exactly.
Go on to that. And let us be holy, for real holy.
Wow.
Let us be holy, the kind of holiness that actually does affect how we interact with those that live with us, that those in society, the disenfranchised, the poor, the weak, the downtrodden, you name it.
Come on.
So I think that those would be those three things
top
that
three things.
we would hear from Wesley. That's why he fought against slavery and fought against a lot of social ills and social injustices of his time. I think we should be at the forefront of that instead of having this ideology that says, oh, Jesus is coming back, let's get out of here. The scholar N.T. Wright, he wrote a book, I forgot again the name of it, but one of the names of the chapters is, Jesus is coming, plant a tree. And I love that title of that chapter because obviously it's a ironic. He's using irony to
He's
point
using sarcasm,
sarcasm,
too.
yeah, to point at how a lot of people feel. Jesus is coming, so let's forget this world. He's like, no, Jesus is coming. Let's plant a tree.
Come on.
So that kind of holiness thinking is missing a lot from the church. We've become, especially those of us in our Protestant movement, we've become so allergic to works, not works like, oh, we have to behave like Christian, but actual works of piety. The feeding the hungry, the doing all those things. We
Yes.
don't see those things as virtuous anymore. We see it like as an extra thing that some good people that have that gift do. Whereas Wesley's version of holiness was like, no, this is for every Christian. We should all be involved in this.
Yes. Awesome. Wow. Thank you, Dave. So we see three things that we can learn from Wesley. Number one is, are you like Jesus? Are you pursuing after him? Is your heart looking like Christ? Do you think like him? Second, have a Catholic spirit. And I immediately think about that whole passage in the Gospels where the disciples come to Jesus. We found this group of people casting out demons, but they weren't a part of us.
Funny, that's the passage he uses for Catholic Spirit sermon,
look at that.
by the way.
One thing that I remember hearing once about Billy Graham, and even though he gets criticized and bashed for certain things, but I love something that he mentions, which is he gets attacked because he's so open and to all these different denominations and things, and they criticize him on that. And he says, why don't you spend some time with people you disagree with? And these people that you disagree with, when you get to know who they are, and your heart changes and your thinking changes. And so, the Catholic spirit, and then
By the way, one of the church fathers, I forget who it is, you might remember, I don't know if it was St. Augustine or who, had said in essentials, unity.
Yes.
In non-essentials, diversity.
Yes.
And in all things, charity,
In all things, charity.
which is love.
Yes, it doesn't come to mind. I know, like the
quote
is
is
there. I'm
familiar.
just like, my mind is like,
You're
grabbing
familiar
for
with the
name.
quote, but
yes,
I don't know who it was.
my mind is grabbing for the
Somebody
name.
said something some time ago.
Something so good like that, right?
But it is great, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, diversity, and in all things, charity,
Charity, exactly.
love.
And, I would just finish off by mentioning what he said, holiness, and looking at holiness from a holistic perspective, seeing the kingdom of God as involving more than just being an individual, but something that reaches out. It has arms, it has legs, and reaches out to others also. So thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you were able to get just a little bit, because we would have to do many, many videos to talk about all the good things that happened during this Methodist revival in the 1700s. But hopefully you will get encouraged to start reading, to start researching, to start learning from people like Wesley, finding out about your roots and how is it that it makes a difference. And then afterwards, for you yourself, not just to have head knowledge, but you then to pursue the heart of God and seek revival, and ask the Lord to revive his church, revive your heart, bring us back to our first love. And so God bless you, and we hope that you're able to receive and learn a lot from this video.